obviously they don't follow that all the time. But the stallions, we're going to be getting out one of the stallions after we deal with these girls. The stallions are always named for their stallion line and their mother's name. So if you have a mare named Kitty, who is bred to a stallion of the Pluto line, then you have Pluto Kitty. So all the guys have a little bit of a feminine name. All right. So we're going to start with some pel work. So Jacqueline, you want to just kind of come and show some stripes, showing kind of slowly how this works. So you may notice she always approaches the horse slightly sideways. I'll show you the reason when I take up the sword for why historically they always approach slightly sideways. There was a lot to keep your horse alive. If you approach it head on, it could be bad for the horse. Good job. So, while we have a lot of strikes when we do sparring on horseback, we also end up practicing a lot working around the pel. So Jacqueline, when you're ready, so in sword fighting with long sword, we kind of end up locking swords and kind of trying to get an advantage. So from horseback solo, you practice a lot on the pel. And so you practice making the horse circle around the pel on this quite small circle. This is actually really, really stinking hard. Just controlling the horse. And if you want to add a couple of little strikes and stuff. But you can also practice little bitty strikes against a more stationary target. Now, see if you can practice the fun one. Turning around. Yeah. Well, the sword's on our right-hand side. It would be really not a great idea if we could only fight on the right-hand side. So we also have to learn how to manage a sword across the horse. This is obviously much harder and can actually become a little bit hazardous to the rider's safety eventually because we have four quarters around us. We have front quarters, those are pretty easy. We have our back right quarter, so we can turn that way. Then we got this back quarter. And you can imagine with a sword, that's really hard to defend. So that's often called the death quarter because someone gets you right from there. Well, that's not a good day. So, you want to show turning around under it? Give it a try. A lot of times we can also practice because sometimes we get really close quarters when sparring on horseback. We can practice holding the sword against the target and turning the horse under the sword, which not only looks cool but is actually quite useful. Sit back. Back, knee inside. There you go. So obviously it's not so easy to do, but it's really fun and looks really cool. So I'm going to put on my helmet now. If y'all have any questions for Jacqueline, go for it. We have a very tame audience today. No questions or anything.
We're mesmerized.
Mesmerized, okay. Take that. They have This is standard for Rubia. Both of these horses were rescues. Are rescues at one point. Rubia is a bit of a driving horse and was not driven in a carriage of appropriate weight. So, you kind of learn to just take off whenever somebody gets on. These girls are not young. They are both in their 20s and picked up sparring at a later age. Okay, Mom, you want to hand me that dog's spool?
No hands.
So we're going to kind of approach a little bit head on, which is totally what we don't do. I'm going to kind of show why very, very gently. I am so sorry, Neela, that I'm going to do this to you. So, head on. Join. I could technically get Girl, I love you. She's like rude. Neela was so offended by that. So, if we went head on at each other, a lot of times knights were known to carry what's called a war hammer. So even if you had hammer or armor on your horse's head, yeah, it didn't do much good against the hammer. We have one. I wish we brought it. We have. Yeah. All right. So we're just going to start off by making a few passes at each other. So you see, we go sideways. We're just kind of making some gentle passes. Now we can turn around, make other passes, and maybe even, good block. But then, when we get into it, let's do a death spiral, we can actually bind and wind, oh, she got me. We can bind and wind against each other, trying to get the advantage over the other person. Good thing distance was our friend there. Girl. Whoops, Ruby is going to switch sides. And Ruby is going to just part out. Good girl, Ruby. Whatever. See, over here, now it's a little bit interesting. I can chase Jacqueline a little bit, try to get on her death corner. However, she can turn around the other way and have the sword against the horse's bob and block and move sideways away. Well, I try to get to her. So I'm trying to see if I can get an advantage. Oh, now she's got my death quarter. There's a lot of trying to get the best position against each other. That is what we aim for a lot of the time when we spar. Aha! So then, good back. So obviously none of us have gotten very good hits so far. That's viral. Because you're all trying to get the advantage on each other. Oh, she got. Now you can do a fair howl. Make point. Or you can make a sharp. You can do a shidle howl. Probably hear Ruby kind of making noise. She actually has a little bit of a funny voice box, so she roars is what we call it. So you hear that noise. She is not grunting angrily, she is just roaring. Not common for horses to do, but it happens. Uh-oh. Ha-ha! Dang it! Kind of gives an idea of how fencing more looks like instead of just the standing side by side. Let's see the stand side by side as Hollywood it. This is how Hollywood likes to show. fighting at each other's blades. This is actually really not smart because in battle we have foot soldiers that might hook onto one of us. Off we go. Or I could just get underneath her sword and just boink. Full title howl there. So we've pieced a lot of this together through history from the old fencing manuals and also just from pictures of exercises that they used to use a lot. So it's very interesting how we've been able to figure out that horse warfare was actually a lot more sophisticated. Yeah, she'll look out there. Yeah, there we go. We've been able to piece together that it's actually a lot more sophisticated on the horsemanship part than we give it credit for. Any questions? No, no questions? Are you entertained?
Yeah.
There we go. Now we got some action from here. Question, yes.
Did they use the horse in the, I heard they were 1800s to 1500s roughly. Did they use them in the Napoleonic Wars?
So not as much these kinds of horses because warfare changed in the 1700s. We got a lot more cannons and we got better guns. So they kind of switched to race horses and would do more straight charges because a lot of race horses were cheaper, like veiled ones were a lot cheaper, and so you could kind of afford to have them be cannon fodder to a certain extent and use them to break up lines in kind of a mass charge. With medieval, they used fewer and they would use them also to break up enemy front line, but the enemy front line had spears and pikes and all of that. So they need to be a little bit better. You also had guys on foot with really massive freaking swords that would break up formations so the horses could get in, work very quickly and get out, and then come back and do again. So they weren't as much Napoleonic, but definitely more prior to that.
And they would be the 1500s because I think it's a misconception. I think didn't the Mongols introduce the horses in the first place?
Not entirely. So we got stirrups in really kind of the Dark Ages. Stirrups were brought over really through the Arab influence, like through Spain.
The Moors.
There were horses. The Romans used Spanish horses a lot, even prior to the Arab influence. The Greeks used horses quite a bit, even mounted. So really the Greeks were kind of the ones to start this. To maybe not as sophisticated an extent because they didn't have stirrups. So they were riding on sheep skins or other animal skins that, while somewhat grippy, they're not as grippy as these, and they don't help keep you in the saddle. So really once stirrups came, that's when stuff really started to change. And there's actually a lot of interesting history, even relating to soil science, as to why this developed the way it did in Europe and not in other places. So it's really very, very fascinating. You can kind of go down a lot of rabbit holes there.
Yeah, there's some really good books out there on it.
Yeah.
So you would say like it wasn't the Mongols that introduced it. It was more of the Moors.
Yeah, the Moors introduced the type of saddle that was more
Okay.
used, but there was still already some stuff left over from the Romans.
Yeah, and obviously the Minoans and Mycenaeans.
Yeah,
But,
and you had, you also had the Scythians had a pretty good influence because, or the Parthians, both because they really had a strong influence in mounted archery in the area. That's where you hear the Parthian shot, where they shoot backwards over the horse. That was something they really liked to use. Feign to retreat and then, psych, is very brutally effective. I don't see as much mounted archery in Western Europe, though. Yeah, I see more on foot archery. A little bit in.
It was also the type of warfare they did, like a lot of the stuff up in Mongolia and all of that. It's more tribal. It's a lot of
a little more skirmishes.
yeah. And you didn't have the
smaller.
same type of armor or anything
Yeah.
There's a really good book by Dr. Deb Bennett called Conquerors that, if you can find it, because it's out of print, is a very good one that details out like all these different groups of horses and where they were kind of developing at the same time in history. So you have different breed types and different horses that for the area, because you had different amounts of forage or availability to get food to horses, and so they also kind of developed around what was available resource-wise for that too.
Well, like there's theories why you don't see as much in China with mounted warfare, is that Chinese soil is a bit lower in selenium, which is a very, very important mineral for horses. So that's a theory, because you don't see a lot. It's kind of surprising how big Imperial China was. Whereas Mongolia, you have a lot of horseback fighting. And it turns out they think that's a theory, is that the soil types are different enough that the horses didn't do as well in China, where they did very well in Mongolia. So a lot of different elements that make it very fascinating but complicated scene, so to say. So I think I saw a question over here.
I was just going to ask, so when you're actually in battle and you get knocked off your horse, where does the horse go? What happens to the horse? Do they stay with their rider, or do they run scared?
Depends. And also kind of nice spoils of war. You get the other guy's destrier.
Yeah, I was about to say, they were pretty valuable. I mean, they've got accounts of, because the horses that, you were riding in suits of armor and all of that, they had a high level of training. They were extremely valuable. People really weren't interested in killing them.
And they were hard to get, too. So it was hard to get a good destrier, just what's the term they used in that time. So, like, often they'd have a gaited horse for traveling, and they'd pony the destrier, and then they'd swap over when it got time to fight. So, I mean, generally, you didn't want to kill the other guy's horse unless you had to. It happened. There's details about that, but it was not necessarily your first move. To get the other guy off and steal his horse, it was a good day, man.
That reminds me.
So yeah, while we do have details of how to do it, it was not the primary thing. So, and they use these horses at similar ages as these two girls. So these two girls are 24 years old and still actively working, actively doing lessons, obviously actively sparring. Yes, we are, Rubia. So, we kind of took this slower so people could see better, but they do some pretty advanced stuff. And that was typical for that period too. We see details of someone buying a horse as a 3-year-old, and just later on, as they're taking inventory, kind of for insurance sort of purposes, they would record the same horse like 20 years later as like, oh, this is my valuable war horse I'm actively using. So if they lost it, they could get some compensation for losing that very valuable horse. Very fascinating stuff. I know that one sent it there. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question about the swords. So, I've worked with the Chinese broadsword. I know they have variants of it. So, like, what I'm trying to say is, like, we were talking about China earlier and how they fought, like, how they sometimes fought on horseback. Well, I know that there's a specific type of broadsword they use that was cavalry based that would shatter on impact. Why would they make a floppy sword like that? Like, why would they do that?
You're talking about Tian, right?
A lot of it is the metal. So, Asia does not necessarily have the purest sources of iron to make steel. So that's where Japanese katana, curved. They'd harden the one edge with a really good steel that they could get, and then they'd use the mild steel with more impurities on the back for the flexibility. But honestly, it was just to make the most of what they had. So that was kind of part of that is you could over-temper slightly and it shatter. You could technically kind of remelt it it, reuse it later. But yeah, a lot of it was just what they had available. So they turned that into an advantage. And so that's they kind of tout the advantage, but they don't necessarily say, well, our steel's not as good as Europe. They may not have known that their steel was a little bit less pure and stuff. But
That's also where you get differences in armor. I mean, if you're not going to be able to make armor that's going to, be able to be hard enough to not just explode on you, then you're not going to make it.
yeah, and so that's where you have all those different kind of Asian armor types that use more bone scales, bamboo, which I mean is fantastic, and a lot more kind of scale-based armor, like more earlier Greek armor. A lot of that's just what they had, and it's friggin' good. It's very effective. If you look at tests against that stuff, it would keep the guy alive unless it was a really significant cut, usually around the armor. So, but that's where that kind of came from, is all this different, what you had available, you can make it as good as you can. So, yeah, very good questions though.
And the last question I have is, it's about Europe and Asia. So I know in Alexander the Great basically took down a bunch of people, I think all the way to somewhere in India. I don't remember which dynasty India had at the time, but I remember they still had elephants. So I'm just wondering, like, how the battles go there, like horses versus elephants, how that worked.
So, if your horse really trusted you, then yeah, I mean, your horse can move a bit quicker, and you could probably get more kind of under and make a nice cut to the poor elephant. But one of the big problems, and one of the reasons they use elephants so much in Central Asia and even North Africa is because if you didn't train your horse around them, that is a crazy freaking animal. So a lot of times they kind of had to ditch the horses and just go on foot, because horses are like, no, no way. Because the smell, the sight, the noises, that's kind of a multi-sensory
tell me how to do some punch made depth stuff?
newness for this gray animal.
Yeah, I was wondering about the.
They can kind of turn that around, and they're, I can't remember what they used against elephants. A lot of times to make the elephants smooth. Sometimes they did, I don't remember.
I remember they used a lot of spears.
Yeah, spears, they could make the elephants rear, and that would make people fall off backwards if they weren't careful. There was something that they could use that the elephants often were like, no way, and so they had to ditch the elephants too.
It may have been longer range stuff, but they still had projectiles.
Yeah, it might have been projectiles, might have been like fire-based weapons.
Yeah.
Breathe fire, naphtha,
Arrows with flames.
I also remember they used a lot of spikes on the ground. Like they would put these wooden traps, and the elephants would fall on them. But
yeah, that was also very common. Once they knew that was a threat. Once you train the horses up to get over it, then horses are a lot faster.
yes.
And elephants, horses you can train to be very, very sensitive, to not need a lot. One of our teachers we both worked with, he does a lot in full armor, and he got kind of a new set of armor for his horse, and his armor locked where his lower legs were kind of off the horse, and then the reins kept catching in the armor that goes over the horse's neck, and his horse was getting really irritated, so he kind of had no hands, no legs, and still was able to spar and do all this stuff. So you can train horses very well like that. Elephants are much, much harder to get to that level of sensitivity. So there's a little bit of that disadvantage as well, that you have to a little bit more, move them over with the stick and, move them back. So not as maneuverable. So a lot of little nuances like that influence the grand scheme of battles and wars. So
I think it's interesting that elephants have a driver and a commander, whereas there is and a horse is just one guy. I thought that was interesting.
It's very interesting
Yeah.
how that works with the different ways of controlling these animals. and some of even the unintended consequences of different animal usages.
Yeah, elephant stampedes are ugly.
Yeah, yeah, and sometimes hard to direct. Sort of like they, you know, in World War II, they trained dogs to carry bombs under tanks. And of course this was a German tactic, they trained the dogs on German tanks. So it didn't really go exactly the way they intended to. So, yeah, those kind of things have happened throughout history. So, any other questions? That's pretty much it. Well, we're going to take these girls back and I'm going to get our stud out and show some of this stuff a little bit higher speed solo. So, yeah, that should be continued.